Professor Alvin Rosenfeld founded and leads the Institute for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism at Indiana University Bloomington. It is an island of good scholarly practice and thinking that sits in a wider hostile environment. It is the only such centre in America, and it was part of the inspiration for our project, the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism. Here, Professor Rosenfeld discusses the old trope of Christian antisemitism, that the Jews are guilty. He shows how the same insight is expressed in today's America, but in distinct ways, each of which is appropriate to a particular kind of discourse.
Okay. So let me greet everyone as well from Bloomington, Indiana. It's a great pleasure to be with you all. Some of you I know are tuning in from the UK, others from this country and elsewhere. Given the nature of the work we do, David, this will not be a lecture in which I crack any jokes because it's a somber subject. In my next lifetime, I'm going to devote myself, I think, to poetry or music or something joyful. But in this lifetime, I spend my days and nights, every day and night, like you, except for Shabbat, taking a hard look at anti-Jewish hostility. I'm going to concentrate especially on America today for reasons that will become clear. America, as you all know, is a large and prosperous country, but it's presently beset by intense social and political disputes, deepening economic troubles, widespread violence, including mass shootings, a massive and destructive drug scene, and other sources, I'm sorry to say, of divisive and debilitating behavior. Ongoing angry debates about racial, gender, and class privilege and oppression fuel the country's acrimonious culture wars and prevent the development of anything remotely like social harmony and national cohesion. All of this turmoil is radically destabilizing, and it contributes to an overwrought condition of almost tribal hostility. It's a natural breeding ground, we know, for the open release of passionate hatreds, including hatred of Jews. Until recently, most American Jews have felt relatively immune to anti-Semitism, but for reasons that will soon be spelled out, that is no longer so. Let me acknowledge at the outset that anti-Semitism in America is multi-causal, as it is elsewhere. No one factor is responsible for its resurgence in our own day. Its actors are diverse, as are the passions that motivate them to target Jews. They align with the political left, the political right, with radical elements of Islam, within segments of the country's Black community and elsewhere. In my talk to you today, I will emphasize some of the specifically Christian dimensions of this hostility, not because they are the primary or the dominant source of animosity to Jews in today's America, but because they have a persistence and a potency within the United States that sometimes causes harm. To illustrate, I begin with an incident that may sound trivial. It's not. On a snowy Shabbat morning in late January of this year, Donnie Larman, previously unknown, a snowplow operator in Lakewood, New Jersey, saw two Orthodox Jews walking on the road in front of him. He lowered his vehicle's plow blades and he intentionally covered them with snow. A film clip of the incident he posted on Facebook shows Mr. Larman laughing at what he had just done to his Jewish victims and triumphantly calling out, "This one's for you, JC." If, as is likely, JC signifies Jesus Christ, burying two Jews in snow is but a tiny entry in the vast historical ledger of Christian retribution for the Jews' alleged crucifixion of Jesus. As payback, far worse has happened to Jews over the centuries. But the fact that this incident occurred at all in present-day America and was gleefully showcased on Facebook is telling. What does it tell? Despite our wishes to the contrary, some ancient motives for Jew hatred are by no means past, but remain a threatening presence among us. How large a threat? I'll venture some answers shortly. For now, consider another seemingly minor but no less telling example of contemporary Jew hatred, this one in the form of graffiti. It reads simply but clearly, "The Jews are guilty." Surrounded by crudely drawn swastikas, these words, "the Jews are guilty," were prominently spray painted on the wall of a Holocaust museum in St. Petersburg, Florida, in May of 2021. Similar graffitis have appeared time and again on synagogues, Jewish schools, and other Holocaust monuments and memorials. Their purpose is clear: intimidate Jews by defacing their most emblematic institutions with hostile markings. This one, "the Jews are guilty," is an expression of contempt that originates centuries ago in Christian teachings about Jews as agents of evil in one form or another. It is alive still today. Versions of it, always accusatory and damning, are part of the contemporary rhetoric of anti-Jewish vilification. The question needs to be asked, of what precisely are the Jews guilty? Answers vary, but to anti-Semites of all kinds, Jews and increasingly the Jewish state are denounced as being eternally at fault for causing whatever is bad, wrong, or evil in the world. Just how this notion of ingrained Jewish malevolence plays out in today's America will be the focus of what follows. Anti-Semitism, as we all know, is a global phenomenon. It's been on the rise in Europe and elsewhere, since the turn of the millennium. For our purposes today, I will be looking only at America and examining some of the religious dimensions of anti-Jewish hostility in this country. Most Western European countries seem to be in a post-Christian phase, but within America's social and political life, Christianity continues to have a significant presence. Multi-denominational, the religion has a wide variety of confessional, doctrinal, and institutional forms. On the positive side, and there is a positive side, and I emphasize it, the Jewish people and the Jewish state can count on the support of many Christian friends. In fact, as a recent Pew poll reveals, Americans like Jews more than any other religious group in the country. At the same time, Christian adversaries exist and are sometimes in opposition actively to the interests of American Jews and the safety and security of the Jewish state. On the most vulgar level, demonization of the Jew is perpetuated through ready-at-hand associations of Jews with Satan or the devil, a connection that originates in numerous New Testament passages about Jews and the so-called synagogue of Satan. I won't quote those directly, but those of you who are interested can look in Revelations 2:9, 3:9, and elsewhere. Long ago, the appellation of the Jews as evil incarnate, the devil's own people, take a look at John 8:44, took on a life of its own and became a popular anti-Semitic catchphrase. Those who use it as justification for harming Jews may know nothing at all of its scriptural provenance or be regular churchgoers, and yet they have absorbed the widespread image of devilish Jews, and they sometimes act upon it to assault Jews. On the higher level of religious discourse, which I'll be getting to in the latter part of my presentation, hardcore Christian replacement theology posits that God's ancient promises to the Jews were nullified or superseded with the coming of Christ. Jews refuse to see themselves, of course, in these terms. They would not be Jews at all if they did so. And they are constantly liable to be scorned as a result of this refusal as accursed and apostate people. To those who embrace such thinking, God's assignment of the land of Israel to Abraham and his descendants is negated. A religio-political view that encourages aggressive forms of anti-Zionism that demonize the Jewish state as an evil entity and delegitimize its right to exist. Let me stress, by no means do all churches hold to these views, but among those that do, and I'll be mentioning some shortly, the obsolescence of the Jews is a given, as is the guilt of the Jewish state. To put the problem in context, America has never been altogether free of anti-Semitism, but most American Jews have not had to contend with ongoing hostility of a seriously threatening kind. Social prejudice of an anti-Semitic nature has long been a fact of American life, and there have been instances of episodic violence directed against Jews, synagogues, Jewish schools, and other communal institutions. But compared to the experiences of Jews in Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, most American Jews have not lived with serious concerns about chronic persecution and lethal attacks. Especially in the decades following World War II, Jews in America have felt largely safe and at home. This sense of security and relative normality can no longer be taken for granted. Hostility to Jews in both word and deed is now a growing presence within the public sphere and has been moving from the fringes where it has long existed into the mainstream. Pittsburgh, Poway, Jersey City, and Muncie are the sites of recent and particularly deadly attacks, but in less dramatic and often unreported and underreported ways, assaults against Jews in New York City, Chicago, Los Angeles, Miami, and elsewhere have become commonplace. According to recent surveys, in fact, the numbers of attacks against American Jews and Jewish institutions appear to be increasing year by year. No one can say for sure just how bad such hostility may become, but downplaying the destructive potential of Jew hatred is always a mistake. In whatever forms it takes, anti-Semitism is meant to be punitive and is meant to cause harm, sometimes fatally so. As Jean Amery, the Austrian Jewish author and Holocaust survivor, learned the hard way, in an age of impassioned and pervasive anti-Semitism, and I quote Amery, every Jew is a dead man on leave. Are we living in such an age? Not yet. But any knowledgeable observer of today's anti-Semitism recognized that acts of overt antagonism towards Jews, both verbal and physical, are multiplying day by day and are now at the highest level they've been in decades. The upsurge of assaults is frequently noted in Jewish sources, but it's gained far too little serious attention in mainstream media. When the latter bother to cover outbreaks of anti-Jewish hostility, the accounts are often thin or sometimes faulty. For instance, when a gunman flew in from Great Britain and took 4 Jews hostage in Colleyville, Texas synagogue in January of this year, the incident gained some public attention for a few days, although in some odd ways. In its initial coverage of the incident, for instance, the New York Times relegated the story to one of its back pages. A prominent FBI spokesman failed to label the event. After all, what did it involve? An assailant entering a synagogue and taking the rabbi and 3 of his congregants hostage at gunpoint, failed to label this event as one specifically related to the Jewish community, a statement later recanted. Most mainstream media sources were also reluctant to identify the gunman, Malik Faisal Akram, as an Islamist terrorist and simply identified him as deranged. Given some of his delusional views about Jewish power, derangement no doubt figured in, but that's often the case among hardcore anti-Semites. The Jews they go after are mostly imaginary figures, all powerful, the incarnation of evil forces, often allied with Satan or the devil himself. I realize that this reference to diabolical Jews must sound archaic, but in fact it has a significant contemporary resonance that needs to be noted by anyone seeking to understand how anti-Jewish hostility is proliferating in today's America. The origins of such hatred are various: social, cultural, economic, political, and religious, but demonological anti-Semitism, often unacknowledged, is in fact one of these causes. Consider the following, which may or may not be familiar to you. In November of 2020, attorney Georgette Kaufman was murdered and her husband shot and seriously wounded at their home in El Paso, Texas, by a man named Joseph Alvarez, who in his own words, and I quote him, was aiming to execute and exterminate pro-choice Jewish Satan worshippers. Alvarez did not know the Kaufmans. He had never met them, but he was convinced they belonged to what he called, and I quote him again, the Jewish Satanist Party, and he considered that they were involved in performing what he called abortions by magic in a park near their house. Regarding abortion as what he called a form of Jewish child sacrifice, he felt it his duty to execute people he regarded as Jewish Satanists. The phrase is his. Alvarez is clearly delusional, and yet it would be a mistake to dismiss his case as just another instance of personal derangement. For in its quasi-religious underpinnings, his story resembles numerous others of a similar kind. The following, probably now familiar to you, so I'll mention it only briefly, took place on October the 27th, 2018, when Robert Bowers, previously unknown, stormed into Pittsburgh's Tree of Life synagogue and shot 17 people, killing 11 of them. It's considered the deadliest attack against Jews in American history. Who was the assailant? An ardent nationalist and white supremacist, Bowers regards Jews as what he called the enemy of white people. He claimed that they are actively at war against white people. Those are his words. Determined to slaughter Jews, he entered the Pittsburgh synagogue at 10 a.m. on a Shabbat morning, calling out, and I quote his hideous words, "All Jews must die," and he gunned down a group of elderly Jewish worshippers. Seized by policemen who had rushed to the scene, Bowers told one of the arresting officers, I quote him again, "They're committing genocide to my people. I just want to kill Jews." Why, we ask, was he so enraged against Jews? He had numerous reasons, but prominent among them, as he wrote in one of his social media postings, is that Jews are, and I quote him again, the children of Satan. News of his bloody crime came as a shock to most people, but not to all. Exactly 6 months later to the day, on April the 27th, 2019, John Ernest, also previously unknown, followed Robert Bowers' murderous example and entered the Chabad synagogue in Poway, California, on the last day of Passover. Armed with a semi-automatic rifle and shouting his words, "Jews are ruining the world," he killed one person and wounded 3 others, including the rabbi. After the shooting, he declared, I quote his words, "I feel no remorse. I only wish I killed more. I am honored to be the one to send these vile anti-humans into the pit where they shall remain for eternity." John Ernest credited Bowers for inspiring him to kill Jews in the Poway synagogue. Until he carried out his deadly shooting, Ernest would have seemed an unlikely person to plan such a crime. 19 years old at the time, he grew up in a stable family. His father is a science teacher, had been a nursing student, claimed to have lots of friends, played piano seriously for many years, and regularly attended his parents' Orthodox Presbyterian church. For 18 months prior to the shooting in Poway, however, he led an active life on the internet and was an avid poster on 8chan's poll board, a gathering site for white nationalists, anti-Semites, and neo-Nazis. Just before the Poway shootings, Ernest posted a 4,300-word open letter or manifesto on that site. He presented himself as a martyr prepared to sacrifice himself on behalf of what he called his race and in defense of Christianity. White Christians, he was convinced, were under attack by Jews, whom he charges with responsibility for the death of Jesus and any of a number of early Christian saints. Addressing himself to my brothers in Christ, he claimed, and I quote him, that Jews are inspired by demons and Satan and will attempt to corrupt your soul with sin and perversion. All of that quoted. A believing Christian, he assured his readers that they are secure in Christ, and he added, I quote him again, one cannot love God without hating Satan. His way of hating Satan, it turns out, was to go after the Jews, the devil's very own people, as he understood them to be. Among other evil deeds, Jews, in his view, and I'm quoting him again, fund politicians and organizations who use mass immigration to displace the European race. An ardent white supremacist, he's sure, his words, that there are brave white men alive who have the willpower and courage it takes to say, forgive the vulgar language I'm about to use, it's his, fuck my life, I'm willing to sacrifice everything for the benefit of my race and my religion. In this spirit, he writes, that he's personally prepared, I quote him one last time, to willingly sacrifice my future for the sake of my people, our people. I would die 1,000 times over to prevent the doomed fate that the Jews have planned for us. As these and similar sentiments reveal, Ernest's thinking combines traditional Christian anti-Semitism and militant white nationalism. This amalgam of two deeply hostile anti-Jewish ideologies is growing on the American far right today, where Nazi insignia at times mingle with large handheld crucifixes in angry street demonstrations. Both were on display at the infamous Capitol insurrection in Washington, D.C. on January the 6th of 2021 and elsewhere, including a Holocaust Remembrance Day event in May of a couple of years ago in a small Arkansas town when white supremacist protesters carrying Nazi flags, crosses, and pictures of Jesus and signs saying the Holocaust never happened, but it should have, broke up the events. Such activities are fed, we know, by several sources, including a small but passionate Christian identity movement that dates to the 19th century and today is undergoing a revival on the populist and nativist right, where it combines white aspirations for racial purity with a return of familiar medieval Christian accusations against Jews. Joseph Alvarez, Robert Bowers, and John Ernest are only a few among numerous others motivated by a racially and religiously inspired white supremacist American Christian neo-nationalism. It was ostentatiously on display at the large Unite the Right March in Charlottesville, Virginia, in August 2017, where shouts of "Jews will not replace us" rang out from people wearing Nazi symbols and signs carrying the words "Jews are Satan's children." The internet sites many in this crowd frequent make clear that Jews are an evil, threatening, conspiratorial cabal and need to be dealt with. These people are angry, they are armed, and they're determined to kill Jews, and some of them are doing just that. On December the 10th, 2019, David Anderson and Francine Graham stormed their way into a kosher supermarket in Jersey City, New Jersey, guns blazing, and killed 4 people. Police later found a bomb in the assailant's car intended to blow up a synagogue in a nearby town. In some of their Facebook postings, they referred to Jews as Nazis and adherents of the synagogue of Satan. That same month, on the 7th night of Hanukkah, 2019, Grafton Thomas entered a rabbi's home in Monsey, New York, and stabbed and slashed 5 people with a machete. One of them, an elderly rabbi, lay unconscious in the hospital for several months before dying of his wounds. After Mr. Thomas was captured, an investigation of his phone showed he had been searching for what he called Zionist temples within the area. He was also looking for answers to the question he wrote down: why did Hitler hate the Jews? A fellow Jew hater, he no doubt was seeking justification for what he was about to do with his machete once he made his way into a Zionist temple. Unable to force his way into the synagogue adjacent to the rabbi's home, he entered the house itself and went on a stabbing spree. One cannot generalize about the motives of all these people, for they're hardly alike. Bowers and Ernest are radical white supremacists. Anderson and Graham subscribe to an extreme version of the Black Hebrew Israelite movement, a militant religious sect that regards Jews as imposters and satanic. And Grafton Thomas, born a Christian, evidently identified as a Muslim convert, but in his journals also sympathized with the Black Hebrew Israelite denunciation of Jews as devils and demons and Satan's people. What they have in common is clear. They all despise Jews, hold them responsible for most of the world's problems, refer to them as the children of Satan and the incarnation of evil, and have no inhibitions whatsoever against murdering as many of them as they can. The brutality that I have been sketching in here is not an isolated phenomenon, but part of an upsurge of violence against American Jews and Jewish institutions. What enrages these people and inspires them to assault Jews varies a good deal, but always it stems from a passionate conviction that Jews are guilty. Guilty of what, we ask? And their answer is everything that is morally reprehensible, threatening, dangerous, and even diabolical. These notions of an inherent Jewish wickedness are widely disseminated on the internet and on the street, and are now so common as to be almost folkloric. In short, they are part of a popular parlance of Jew hatred that is flourishing, requires no intellectual or moral justification, and bonds together people who despise and aim to harm Jews. Violent people of the kind I've been describing adopt and often act on the hatreds the culture at large offers to them. Well beyond the street level, where Jew hatred gets enacted physically, the sources for such antagonism have a well-developed theological basis that dates to the beginnings of Christian anti-Judaism. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, some churches have recognized the presence of hostile views on Judaism and the Jews within their teachings and preaching, and have sought to moderate them. But such sentiments are alive and even resurgent within other churches, including the small Orthodox Presbyterian Church, in which John Ernest's family are prominent members. I went on to that church's website, and among other things I found, and that you could find, are the following beliefs, and I quote from that website. The Orthodox Presbyterian Church uses the Westminster Confession of Faith and catechisms, familiar to those of you in the UK. In chapter 19, paragraph 3, we confess that the people of Israel, God's people in the Old Testament, are a church under age. The same is true for its ceremonial laws, containing several ordinances, partly of worship, prefiguring Christ, his graces, actions, sufferings, and benefits, and partly of diverse instructions of moral duties, all of which ceremonial laws are now abrogated under the New Testament. I continue to quote from the website. In other words, we believe that Old Testament Israel was the church before Christ came. To them also, as a body politic, he gave sundry judicial laws, which expired together with the state of that people, not obliging any other now, further than the general equity thereof may require. Continuing. In other words, the nation of Israel as it existed as the people of God in the Old Testament is no more. Galatians 6:16 informs us that the church is now the Israel of God. In the Old Testament, the church, called the nation of Israel, consisted of the blood descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But in the New Testament, the church now consists of all those who believe God's promise, along with Abraham. We who trust in Christ are now the nation of Israel. Therefore, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church holds that the political geographical entity known as Israel is not significant in and of itself, We pray for the blood descendants of Abraham, the Jews, that they might also believe in Jesus. All of that quoted from the church website. Now, it's not possible to conclude, even given what I just read out to you, that the religious doctrines of that church, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, which are basically grounded in supersessionist thinking and replacement theology, directly by themselves incited John Ernest to want to murder Jews. As I already called your attention to, other factors were involved. Nevertheless, his church's belief that God's original covenant with Israel has been rendered obsolete and that Christians and the church have replaced Jews in Israel in God's design, fundamentally question the ongoing validity of Jewish life and Israel's right to exist. Ernest's church is hardly alone in advancing a Christian-inspired denigration of the status of Jews and the Jewish state. Consider the following as just a few examples among many that could be cited. At a major Episcopal Church General Convention in mid-July 2018, Bishop Suffragan Gail Harris, the second leading officer in the Episcopal Diocese of Massachusetts, testified in support of a resolution that condemned Israel for alleged human rights abuses. I quote from her testimony of July 13. These are her words in their entirety. We do know that there are both sides that share a story, and there are different sides within each story. But this story is about the power of a state over an oppressed people. And while Palestinians may throw rocks and burn tires and have graffiti, the Israeli government has used consistently weapons that are militaristic and are violent. Pay particular attention, please, to what follows. In her words, I was there a couple of years ago on the Temple Mount. A 3-year-old little boy, a Palestinian with his mother, was bouncing a rubber ball. The ball happened to sort of roll away from him and go over the side down to the Western Wall, otherwise known as the Wailing Wall. And immediately Israeli soldiers came up to the Temple Mount and attempted to put handcuffs on the 3-year-old little boy for bouncing a rubber ball. She continues, I was there when a teenager, I think he was 15, was walking down the street and asked the military vehicle of the Israeli government a question. And because that question was not one to the liking of those soldiers, the boy began to run as they threatened him, and they shot him in the back 4 times. He fell on the ground, and they shot him another 6 times. Violence on both sides, she concludes, is deplorable, but those who have greater power and technology have a greater responsibility for constraint. All of that quoted. As it happens, the charges made in Bishop Harris's testimony were entirely false. Not only were her stories against Israel unsubstantiated and unverifiable, but they evidently were simply made up. The incidents of Israeli military atrocity that she reported seeing never happened. When challenged to substantiate her claims of having personally witnessed such savage behavior, Recall that in her testimony, she twice proclaimed, "I was there." Bishop Harris admitted she in fact saw nothing of the kind, but merely reported what she had heard from others. Who were the others? She never identified them. Her supposed eyewitness testimony, in short, was no more than hearsay, had no validity, and was nothing more than an exercise in anti-Israel propaganda, harmfully set forth by a major Episcopal bishop at her church's national convention. Persuaded after criticism by the head bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Massachusetts to apologize, she did so, although only a month later, adding that while she could not verify the truth of her testimony, she offered it out of sincere passion for justice for all people. Those are her words. What can we conclude? Jews, and in this case, the Jewish state, evidently fall outside the circle of her passion for justice. They do so as well among other prominent American church leaders who are similarly given to making passionate, justice-driven accusations against alleged Israeli perfidy. On Martin Luther King Day last year, for instance, J. Herbert Nelson II, the statist clerk of the Presbyterian Church USA, gave a sermon in which he accused Israel of responsibility for carrying out what he called nothing less than 21st century slavery, his words. He also called on American Jews to use their power to influence the United States government to end what he denounced as Israel's cruel treatment of the Palestinian people. The stated clerk, that's his office, is the highest ranking position in the Presbyterian Church after the moderator or chairman. Responsible for the office of the General Assembly, which conducts the ecclesiastical work of the church, he's someone to be listened to. That is particularly so when Dr. Nelson, the first African American elected to the office he holds, chooses Martin Luther King Day to excoriate Israel for what he called, his words, the immoral enslavement of Palestinians. Such charges are outrageous, but the Reverend Nelson went well beyond them in a video he made and posted on his church's website shortly thereafter. The video, entitled "This is Not What God Intended," is devoted entirely to vilifying Israel and its American Jewish supporters. Here are some lines that I quote from the video. "We must deal with this issue of Israel-Palestine and do it in a way that's effective. We must begin to look at the community here in the United States of Jewish individuals who have come throughout and are supporting these particular activities that are going on. And we must hold accountable our government over and over again to do what is right. Somehow or another, we've forgotten that money and power and all these things are not necessarily permanent. There is something about our soul that's important. There's something about our life that ought to matter. And there's something about the end of life that we believe in. Somehow or another, there will be a just reward, and we need to work towards that. Listen in particular to the following. What I witnessed in my visit to Israel was in fact evil. It was evil, and it remains evil. And the Church of Jesus Christ must just call it that. And we must call the current Israeli regime to step down, and we must call the American president and the American Congress to denounce what is taking place in Palestine, Israel. It is 20th century slavery and some of the worst atrocities that the world has ever seen. Our handprint is all over it, particularly with the surveillance and everything else. We've found a way to help surveil that as well as taking an opportunity to support them with armaments, to kill and maim, and to, in all things, shame individuals who they see as less than human. That's not the world God intended. There's more, but you get the gist of what he's saying. Embracing almost 9,000 congregations in America, the Presbyterian Church USA is a divided body, and it does not speak with a single voice about Jews, Judaism, and Israel. But the Reverend Nelson's sentiments are representative of a long and radical history within the church of demonizing Israel, and in this instance, also attacking American Jews for what he calls using their money and power in support of what he calls Israel's evil policies. The charges are scurrilous, but that hardly matters to those within the Presbyterian Church USA, who in the name of peace and justice are committed to advancing a theologically driven Christian call to arms against Israel. That call was strongly set forth in 2014 with the release of the booklet Zionism Unsettled, produced by the church's Israel-Palestine Mission Network. The authors set out to refute Zionism as what they call a false theology and a heretical doctrine, and they went so far as to claim that Zionism promotes death rather than life and is responsible for ethnic cleansing and cultural genocide. An openly hateful polemic against Israel's legitimacy and right to exist, Zionism Unsettled provoked a heated debate within the Presbyterian Church USA. By no means do all Presbyterians agree with it, but some do. Some called for the church to cease distributing the booklet, and yet it's still available for purchase on the church's website. The denomination's ardently professed anti-Zionism was reinforced this past June at the Presbyterian Church USA's latest General Assembly, where numerous anti-Israel resolutions were passed, some denouncing Israel for what they call the crime of apartheid, others criticizing what they call the heightened Zionist Jewish identity of Jerusalem, others opposing anti-BDS resolutions adopted by government and institutional bodies, labeling Christian Zionism idolatrous and heretical, and a recommendation that May the 15th, within the period marking Israel's independence, from this point on be observed annually in Presbyterian churches as Palestinian Nakba Remembrance Day. At previous assemblies, the Presbyterian Church USA spoke out for divestments from major firms doing business in Israel, objected to moving the American embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, called on the US Congress to reject the Abraham Accords, describing the peace deal normalizing relations between Israel and Arab states as dangerous. In sum, and I'm about to conclude, a deep and long-standing hostility to Israel resides politically and doctrinally within the Presbyterian Church USA. The anti-Zionist movement within this church, raised to the level of political theology, is well established and well funded, and has its counterparts in some other American Protestant churches as well. Such biased thinking against the Jewish state will now be greatly enhanced through the recent appointment of the Reverend Dr. Jerry Pillay to become the General Secretary of the World Council of Churches. A Presbyterian minister and academic dean at the University of Pretoria in South Africa, Dr. Pillay is on record supporting movements to boycott Israel and comparing what he calls, quote, the exclusionary and violent character of the Israeli Zionist project to South Africa's racial apartheid regime. Indeed, following a visit to what he called the Holy Land, in which he confesses he found nothing holy, he reports that he and his fellow Black South Africans discovered a situation there, and I quote him, that was worse than anything they had seen or experienced in South Africa itself. He accused Israel of subjugating what he called the indigenous people of the land. He urged Christians to resist the empirical ambition of Israeli Jews, and on along similar lines. The World Council of Churches, I remind you, is a very large organization representing an estimated 500 million Christians around the world. Never an Israel-friendly body, it is likely to become even less so under the Reverend Dr. Pillay's leadership. I began by referring to the defacement of a Holocaust museum in Florida with swastikas and the words, "The Jews are guilty." The list of sins for which Jews are said to be guilty is long and growing. Also growing are the hostile passions that trigger heated accusations of Jewish malevolence. These passions are today widespread and intense and provoke a growing number of attacks on individual Jews, Jewish communal institutions, and Israel. In his early book on anti-Semitism, Jean-Paul Sartre recognized the aims of such hatred when he wrote, and I quote Sartre, "What the anti-Semite wishes for and prepares for is the death of the Jew." We can add, what the anti-Zionist wishes for and prepares for is the death of the Jewish state. To lend religious sanction to such wishes is obscene. But such obscenities, sometimes on open display, at other times dressed up in the language of religious piety, are now regularly and brutally directed at Jews and Israel. They are dangerous, and they must be vigorously and effectively opposed. I will end there and be more than happy to take your questions as David moderates them.
Thank you so much, Alvin. I mean, striking how different discourses and different social milieus have different ways of expressing the affirmation that the Jews are guilty.
Yes.
Really, really interesting. I would like to move to some questions.
David, before you do so, I'll just say one other thing. For those wishing to follow up in some detail, Carrie Nelson and Michael Gizzi published last year a very important book, which I have here. It's called Peace and Faith, Christian Churches in the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. It goes into great documented detail about the matters I spoke to you. And I'll recommend one other book that I've drawn on, having to do with the growth in the United States of a kind of Christian political nationalism. The book is called Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States by Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry. There's lots more, but those two books in particular were valuable to me in my own research and would be worth reading. Please, David.
Thank you very much. I would like to throw the discussion open for questions. I know a lot of people will want to ask. Obviously, as always, I would ask people to keep them sharp and to keep them as questions and not too much, not too long speeches from people. First, I'd like to call on somebody who's also very inspirational to our project at the London Centre, and somebody who has been doing incredibly brilliant work for more years than I think she would be happy with me mentioning, Dina Porat.
Thank you. Thank you, Alvin. Thank you, David, for putting up this partnership. Thank you, Alvin, for the lecture, which was a bit depressing, I must say. These are holidays here, and perhaps the anti-Semites that you quoted will be unhappy to hear that we are celebrating Sukkot quite happily. So, first of all, greetings to everyone from Tel Aviv. Alvin, I have the following question. First of all, the point that you made so strongly and convincingly on the first part of your lecture referred to the satanic connection of Jews. And I have a feeling that when you turned to the Presbyterian Church in the second part and gave it as an example, you had less examples of that, of the satanic connection. Of course, the Jewish state, if Israel is a Jewish state, then the Jewish characteristics are falling on Israel and its inhabitants. And if these are satanic, then you don't have even to mention it. But I think I felt the lack of this satanic quotes when you spoke about the Presbyterians. And a second is, did you see any cooperation? These groups that you mentioned in the first part have connections among themselves. One inspires from San Diego in New Zealand to Halle in Germany. Did you find, when you research their expressions, same expressions regarding religion, Satan, the reverse of God, in their connections and in their literature in other countries and in the interactions among them?
Right. Thank you, Dina, and Chag Sameach.
Thank you.
I did not draw a connection, it's true, between the first part and the second part. The first part of my talk really has dealt with anti-Semitic assaults at the street level, very physical assaults, even lethal assaults against Jews. And as we all know, that's multi-causal. Many things feed into it. But one of the things that feeds into it, which I wanted to stress because it's often not recognized, is an almost folkloric element of anti-Jewish passion, rooted really in very early church teachings about Jews as adherents of the synagogue of Satan and so on. Now, I don't for a second charge that all of those people are good church-going Christians who get this stuff from their preachers. It's now part of popular parlance in America. It's folkloric. It's the lingo of the street. It's the lingo of the internet, but it's there in abundance. And one after the other feel somehow justified in assaulting Jews because they're a devilish satanic people. So that was the point of my first part too. It is religious in origin, but by now the religion has just seeped into the mainstream folk beliefs, vulgar language and beliefs of very, very many people. Satan references don't show up in the church discourses that I quoted to you, but many of those people, and I was quoting people at really the highest levels of both the Presbyterian Church and the Episcopal Church, and there are other progressive Protestant churches that resemble them as well, or at least parts of them as well, because these things are fought out within the churches themselves. They don't speak with a single voice. And what I was especially intent on focusing on was those voices are particularly hostile. And they do use the word evil time and again, and they even make things up. Dina, what I quoted to you from that bishop of the Episcopal Church, she's a bishop. She's the second highest in her whole diocese, and not just an ordinary member sitting in a pew in the church. She said, I was there on the Temple Mount. The fact is, none of that stuff happened. And yet she testified that she saw it personally. Well, what does that tell us? Well, it tells us, of course, that she's fabricating, but if we ask what she's fabricating and why she's fabricating it, it goes to the heart of the matter. Evil is characteristic of the country you live in, according to these people. That's vicious, it's dangerous, and it has to be acknowledged for what it is and fought back in every way possible.
Thanks very much, Alvin. I'd like to ask two people to ask their questions now in turn. First of all, Laura Sharrow, very welcome. Laura's video is not working properly, I think, so we will hear her by sound. Hang on, I have to unmute you as well.
Sorry, David, I'm not hearing anything.
Sorry, I'm working on it.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, first of all, for organizing this, David, and all of you. Thank you, Professor, for your excellent lecture. This may be off the subject, and if it is, please tell me, and I will defer to the next questioner. There are those among us, Jewish people on both sides of the pond, who are so terrified, justifiably, of the left that many people are pushing for Trump to be reelected. As an individual, I'm possibly more terrified of that. I don't think he's a friend of the Jews nor of Israel. I think everything with him is transactional. And I would like to hear your thoughts. Again, I understand this may be off the subject, and I will defer to the next person if it is.
No, I can answer briefly if I understand your question correctly. Your biggest concern is with hostility from the left, correct?
My concern is with how many British Jews and American Jews think that Trump is their savior.
Well, I don't want to talk about Trump, but I can say something about the left.
Okay,
The people, the church-based people I quoted, all identify with the so-called progressive wing or left wing of their churches. There are strong voices within those churches. They're not the only voices. They're more conservative voices within those churches that certainly contest what they have to say. But anti-Jewish hostility, as we know today, comes from the left, comes from the right, comes from segments within radical Islam, comes from parts of the Black community. It's just all over the place. What I wanted to concentrate on today doesn't get a whole lot of attention. I'm sure that other talks in David's series and ours will deal with the left or right and so on and so forth. But I wanted to draw attention to the fact we still need to pay attention to certain strains of Christian thinking, especially so-called replacement theology, which leaves no room really for ongoing Jewish life. It's delegitimized, nullified, superseded by the notion that with the coming of Jesus, promises made to the Jewish people, including promises made to Abraham and his descendants about the land, presently called the State of Israel, all of that no longer has validity. Well, that's dangerous thinking, and we need to pay attention to it.
thank you.
Thanks very much. Ken Orbach, I would like to ask you to ask a question.
Thank you again. This has been a wonderful presentation.
I'm sorry, I'm not hearing you, Ken.
This is a wonderful presentation. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
I'm not hearing you. If you have a microphone, maybe you could use it. Oh,
Sorry, I don't. Is this any better?
a bit better.
A bit better.
If I don't hear you, David will tell me.
Okay, I was a graduate student at Indiana University in the 1970s, and there was a regular Ku Klux Klan activity not far from Bloomington in Martinsville. Is that still the case? And second part, the street level anti-Semitism that you described earlier, were criminal prosecutions followed?
Right. So glad to know you were in Bloomington. Bloomington is a good college town. Not far away is Martinsville. And you're right that in its heyday, it was the home of the Ku Klux Klan in a very, very big way. In recent years, there are no problems I'm aware of coming from Martinsville. We are running into some problems, however, on my own campus of a sort that we've not seen before. For instance, mezuzahs on the doorposts of student rooms and dormitories, time and again, have been taken down by vandals. There have also been some swastikas around campus. By and large, life here remains welcoming, hospitable, friendly. Day by day, life is very good. We have a campus of 47,000 students. It's a very big campus. And if you have 10 or 20 students among them who act badly, you can get incidents of this kind. But you're right to call attention to the past history of the region. It's quieted down, I'm glad to say, in that respect. The second part of your question, if you don't mind, Ken, repeating it. Or David, perhaps you could repeat the second part.
Were criminal prosecutions followed?
Yes, there are. Those people are all being investigated. Some of them are no longer alive, but they're jailed, and they will come up for trial. Yes.
Finally, are we reliving the 1930s?
The 1930s were a bad time in America, no question about it, in all kinds of ways, with Father Coughlin and Ford publishing his awful journal and the like. We're not seeing anything that bad. What worries a lot of us in America, though, in addition to the things I put before you, has to do with the entry into American politics of anti-Semitic and certainly some anti-Israel views, especially on the hard left. We have elections upcoming next month. We'll have to see what comes. That's relatively new and troubling.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alvin. I mean, I want to just ask about what I mentioned earlier on, really, which is the immense similarity, really, between different ways of very, very different people focusing on Jews as the guilty party, and of course, yes, not only as being guilty, but as being a kind of key, enemy of the people, or murder of the good, or a kind of universal blockage in the road between us and the good life. And even the slogan, "The Jews will not replace us," seems to me one that is kind of appears similarly with white supremacist warning their fellow so-called white people that the Jews are out to replace them, and then certain kinds of people in an anti-imperialist framework warning the people from all around the world that the Jews are bringing white people in to replace them instead of bringing black people in to replace them. But the replacement itself seems to me to be common.
Right. Yeah, no, you're right about that. And it's all part of a conspiratorial mindset, as we know, that blames Jews for being all powerful, all controlling, and all subversive at the same time. Jews will not replace us originates as a phrase in France, but it's caught on elsewhere, as we know. The organization HIAS, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, originally formed to help Jewish refugees come to this country, in more recent years has been very active in helping refugees come to this country. And they have been targeted for sure as an arm of Jewish power looking to subvert American whiteness, American power, and so on and so forth. So yes, David, you're right about that. The notion that Jews are guilty is very widespread and, of course, damning. It's accusatory in a very robust and pervasive way, and we're said to be guilty of everything under the sun, for sure.
It's a particular kind of symbolic guilt that is sort of guilty for everybody. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions from the chat. I'm going to go to Susan, and I think we are very nearly out of time. There's a question really about the confusion, really, that normally I hear hate groups and Nazi groups referred to as right-wing or outright, and Trump supporters being referred to as right-wing radicals, but I'm hearing them being called left-wing. I wonder if you could say anything about really the sort of relationship between the right and the left, and when it comes to kind of radical critiques of, the democratic state and of using the Jews to do that, how can we really understand the distinction between the left and the right in that context? And just the other question is really that the idea that anti-Semitism is sort of endemic in kind of Western culture and also in Muslim culture. And the question is, however, almost in contradiction to the first part of the question is, why is it flourishing now? What's happening now?
Right. So we're living at a time where we're seeing the rise of populist right-wing parties in a number of different countries. Certainly in Hungary, certainly in Italy, in Spain, and I'm sorry to say in my own country as well. We're also living at a time, and this, I admit, I guess naively so, I didn't foresee, in which Nazism as such, although it still has only a very, very minuscule following here, does have indeed, and does make an appearance as well. Swastikas, for instance, are almost omnipresent these days as an anti-Jewish symbol, and there's nothing deadlier than the swastika, the symbol of Nazi genocide against the Jews. We're seeing that as well. In the Charlottesville March, there were neo-Nazi groups, and the internet is certainly in the better of neo-Nazi sentiment as well. Now, not all right-wing politics takes Nazi form. Most of it doesn't at all, but some of it is very far to the right, especially when it coalesces with a kind of Christian populist nationalism that, as I mentioned, is growing in America as well. The book Taking America Back for God documents that quite copiously, as do other studies as well. So do we have a problem on the right? For sure, we do have a problem on the right. We have, and it's often the right, by the way, that is more violent at the street level. With the left, we don't, I mean, the people I mentioned before shooting up synagogues and the like don't come from the left. They certainly are hardcore right-wing people. The anti-Zionist, anti-Israel stuff, though, is often an expression of the left, and it's a strong expression from the left. It even shows up in certain Jewish so-called progressive circles as well. And these things have a lot of momentum behind them. They've caught on. And many people feel virtuous, actually, that they're upright in declaring themselves in these terms. I find it myself crazy and strongly objectionable. We need to oppose it. I'd like to say we're winning, but I don't believe we are winning. I think there's a lot of passion, a lot of momentum, a lot of organization on the side of our adversaries. So, David, I can only say how pleased I am that you, David Seymour, Philip Spencer, and others are launching the institute that you're launching. It's badly needed. We do have some colleagues, as we both know, in Germany and France and other countries. Dina was just on from Tel Aviv. And the more that we can coalesce and cooperate and collaborate in our efforts, the better. And what is this effort all about? The effort is about opening people's eyes to the threats out there before us. The threats are real and they're growing. I confined myself purposely today to threats from only one region, but by no means do I think we need to overlook or subordinate the other things. In one talk, one can only do so much. And I think not enough attention is being given to certain strains of Christian thinking that contribute to the problems that we address.
Thank you, Alvin. I want to go to two very quick questions to finish off with. First to Susan George, who herself does incredible work opposing anti-Semitism in the Democratic Party in California. Susan.
Thank you so much, David. And you touched on this, and thank you so much, Professor Rosenfeld. It really is, I'm very grateful to be here. my question is with regard to replacement theory. I've always considered that more a right-wing phenomenon, and yet you've spoken to it more. You've spoken to the anti-Israel, anti-Zionism aspect of that. I'm wondering, is that something that has infiltrated more recently, or I'm just, because it seems the conspiratorial thinking seems to span both right and left. And I'm just wondering if you could help me understand that a little bit better.
Yes, I think replacement theory takes a number of different expressions. We're mostly familiar with it, let's say from the Charlottesville, Virginia March, Jews will not replace us, and it's part of a very strong anti-immigrant movement in America. Who are all these foreigners coming in from the southern border and the like, they will replace us and so on. For my talk today, however, I called attention to replacement theory within church teachings. This theology, which is fundamental to Christian thought, that with the coming of Jesus, Judaism has served its purpose. The Jews should be evangelized by the Christian gospel and find their way to truth and salvation. Otherwise, they're just a hangover from what used to be. They've served their purposes, and yet stubbornly, they resist coming to the truth of the gospel. Moreover, look at what they've done. They've gone and returned to their ancestral homelands, no longer recognizing that they have no right to that homeland as well. The descendants of Abraham or somebody else, the descendants really of Jesus and his disciples. And yet the stubborn Jews remain, and not only remain, but remain in a very strong way, have reestablished political sovereignty and national independence in their own land. So what do you do with these bloody Jews? That's a big question.
A final question from the Duchess of Dalston, who I suspect her aristocracy is not quite recognised by the new king, but there was a noise coming from your machine just now. Try unmuting again, please.
She's muted, David.
We're not hearing you. I think you're not muted, but I don't know why we can't hear you. You sound a bit like a kind of Mickey Mouse character right now. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, it's not working. I'm going to leave it there. I want to say a huge thank you to Alvin for that lecture and for taking those questions. I want to take this opportunity to announce our next contribution to the collaboration series of Zoom seminars, which is going to be the Monica Hubscher and her colleagues, who have done some really important, I think, and really interesting work on anti-Semitism on social media, are going to present their findings and their book this time next week. I'm just giving you the link. So do come back next Wednesday. And also, I would like to say that we have had discussions about whether we should charge people to come to these events, but we're an academic centre and we really do not want to be in the business of charging people, but we are in some very serious need of some financial help building the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism, and we would be very pleased if people would like to donate whatever they like and what they might think would be a kind of ticket price that they might expect to pay on the door. So thank you very, very much, Alvin, and to everyone who came and to everybody who participated. Thank you.
David, thank you for inviting me. I can't say it's been a pleasure to present this talk, but I hope it's been meaningful to those who have heard it. David, if you have a way to send me what's in the chat later, please do. If there are people who need to have questions answered, I'll be glad to do that. I've not looked at the chat during the whole time. Thanks to everyone. Be well. And David, may you continue to do all you're doing. We look forward to further collaboration.
Thank you very, very much. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.